And she reminded participants and the experts in the roundtable that shared humanity approach to migration must be anchored in the participation of people and reflect the values of society, that inclusivity and social justice, by their very nature, are wide and all-embracing concept. So as society, we must make important choices and decisions about how to think about things affecting our country, the region, and thereafter when and how we regulate the matters. And following that, I think we have several speakers who really came from different multi-entry points regarding the issue of social justice, economic inclusion, and as well as the migration. And I do think that by having this follow-up conversation is that we also need to really start expanding and even sometimes delve into an area where we talk about when we have a shrinking economies in the continent, in Africa, and even probably globally. Also within that, we've confronted with leadership crisis, where in fact solutions to problems are actually more coming from a very singularly, thinking or narrative instead of something that's look at pluralism, but also that embraces, multiple thoughts. So we have different speakers who again will be speaking on different issues. I'm told that one of the speakers is unable to join us due to not being well, but we have other speakers. Let me just read it through. So just after my welcoming, we have Professor or Dr. Stephen Gordon, who also contributed in the conversation last week. Who will be then Dr. Stephen Gordon will actually be doing the keynote and will give her good 15 to 20 minutes because everyone else will step in the conversation will be coming, from different issues that he would have raised. Professor Adewo Akinola is actually not feeling well, who is meant to be a panelist. And we have Dr. Vanya Castro and Miss Omyo, Mr. Louis Mboko, who will then be stepping in. And then I'll just do a summary of key issues that I imagine. With that, colleagues, let me not waste any further time. I'm going to call on Dr. Stephen Gordon to step in and take the floor for the next 15 to 20 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Let me bring up my slideshow. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear
Excellent.
you.
Thank you so much. So my name is Stephen Lawrence Gordon. I am from the Human Science Research Council. So previously, at our last engagement, I presented on public attitudes towards international migration in South Africa. We had a very short window for that presentation. So what I wanted to do for this engagement is return to this subject matter and maybe unpack some important issues and areas that we didn't really get a chance to get into during the previous session. So I want to reintroduce some of the data sources I'll be using, going over it very briefly so we all remember where we are and that we're on the same page. So I will be presenting data from the South African Social Attitudes Survey. It's a large nationally representative public opinion survey in South Africa. It's been running since 2003. Now, it's always included some questions on international migration, but since 2008, more questions on this issue have been added. So using this data, we are able to look at issues related to xenophobia. Often we term these anti-immigrant sentiments or anti-immigrant apathy to really unpack a lot of the nuance in attitudinal data around international migration. In the media, frequently people make quite broad, sweeping statements about immigrants and what the general public think about immigrants. Using this data, we can really get down into the weeds and unpack some of these important questions. So just a quick word on the data. So this data is designed to be nationally representative, which means we're going to be engaging with people who are both old and young, rich and poor, black and white. So it is quite a robust data set in terms of its representation. Of course, there are small limits, and we can talk about those if you want, but it does allow us to present a very, very comprehensive picture of attitudes as well as attitudinal change over time. So on that issue, I want to talk about a very important misconception that I think was somewhat present and addressed in the previous session, which is how many international migrants live in South Africa. So there is a substantial misconception of how many international migrants reside in the country. So if you ask the general population of the people living in South Africa, how many do you think were born outside the country? About 46% think that more than 17 million international migrants live in South Africa. 36% believe there are more than 25 million. These numbers, of course, completely erroneous. The number of international migrants is more about 4 million, which suggests that often when people think about international migration, they are not approaching it using the correct depiction of the scale of this issue. So this is a graph I presented before, but it bears re-examination. So this is looking at overall welcoming attitudes towards foreigners in South Africa for the period 2003 to 2021. So what you see in this slide is that there is a degree of fluctuation in which in some periods people become more positive than in other periods. So let us look at some of those periods where people had become more positive rather than less positive. So you see there are jumps in pro-immigrant sentiment in 2008 and 2015. Now, one of the things that happened in 2008 and 2015 was large-scale anti-immigrant violence. Now, following that period of violence, there was a wave of anti-xenophobia messaging in the media and by politicians. This seems to have had some effect on the general population. So when field workers visited households following this messaging wave, pro-immigrant sentiments were detected. However, as these messages drop off and more anti-immigrant voices are allowed more breathing room, we see that this pro-sentiment declines and more negative sentiments re-emerge. So often what is depicted in the press is constant stories about how South Africans feel that international migrants are bad. They bring crime, they bring disease, they bring unemployment. But there are many people in South Africa who are much more positive about international migration. So for example, this is a graph depicting agreement with the statement, immigrants bring skills that are needed in South Africa. About 40% of the adult population agreed with that statement in 2021, with only a minority disagreeing. Indeed, World Bank, IMO, and ILO data will tell you that this statement is broadly true. Immigrants do bring much needed skills to South Africa, improving the South African labor market, improving opportunities even for locally born people in the country. So this here is a statement on whether immigrants are generally good for the South African economy. The general population is quite divided on this issue, with a large share disagreeing, but still a significant minority agreeing with the statement. So we see quite a bit of polarization on this issue. Again, the general economic consensus is that international migration is quite positive for South Africa. There are some contestations about whether international migration brings down the wages of highly skilled workers. But in general, there is a feeling that regardless of whether we look at job creation, business opportunities, or the cost of labor, then international migration does have a largely beneficial effect on the general economy. So one of the striking features of the international migration debate in South Africa is that it's very frequently termed in zero-sum terms. So it's very frequently depicted that if an immigrant gets a job, someone else must have lost a job. If an immigrant opens a business, it means less business opportunities for someone else. Now, of course, as I previously mentioned, international migration is not a zero-sum affair. In most cases, international migration is quite positive sum. Now, zero-sum views about international migration are not as common as we may think, but substantial shares of the population do hold these views. The poor is more likely to hold these views than more affluent people. The gradient on this is particularly strong when we talk about business opportunities, with the poor tending to feel that when an immigrant opens a business, it means less business opportunities for everyone else. Again, that's not really how business development works, but we can see the danger of that kind of thinking in recent anti-immigrant movements that have sprung up throughout the country. So one of the issues that frequently occurs in our debates about international migration are concerns about welfare chauvinism, the idea that immigrants should never have the same access to social grants and services regardless of whether they achieve citizenship, regardless of how many taxes they pay, regardless of how long they've lived in the country. Now, this sort of extreme nativism is unfortunately more common than we would like, but is not so common that it blocks out all other options on this front. And there is much more nuance in terms of this welfare chauvinism than often we give credit for in the media. So in closing, I would like to spend a little bit to talk about xenophobic violence. So xenophobic violence often comes to the fore when talking about the issue of xenophobia in South Africa. So to give a good context of xenophobic violence, the following question was included in the South African Social Attitude Survey. Would you ever take part in violent action to prevent immigrants from living or working in your neighborhood? A very clear, straightforward framing of xenophobic violence. Now, we find that about 12% of the adult population in 2021 indicated that they had participated in this type of violence sometime in the past. A remarkably high level of admittance, given the social desirability around this form of violence. Indeed, other questions about violence are not so readily answered, indicating the social acceptability of this form of violence in South Africa. So about 12% of the general public say they have not engaged in this type of violence, but would be willing to engage perhaps sometime in the future. A very worrying statistic for those who are interested in blocking and preventing xenophobic violence in the future. Finally, the vast majority of South Africans, about 74%, indicate they have never engaged in xenophobic violence and would never do so. So there's a series of opinions about why people take part in anti-immigrant violence in South Africa. And we asked the general public which of those are the main reason. And this was an open-ended question. People could really put any answer forward that they liked. Now, the bulk of the answers centered on the negative behavior of immigrants. People often blaming immigrants for crime, for joblessness. And of course, there were other ones: witchcraft, prostitution, human trafficking. This shows you how anti-immigrant stereotypes are used to justify anti-immigrant violence, and how many people see this form of violence as a type of vigilantism. And then finally, we asked people what should be done to stop attacks against foreigners living in the country. This again was open-ended. People could put forward any type of response they liked. So an extremely wide range of different responses was put forward. Some of them were more pro-immigrants, and some of them were very, very anti-immigrants. About 41% of the general population wanted to restrict immigration, expel immigrants, or more greatly police immigrant behavior as a solution to xenophobic violence. This segment of the population being that which is the most negative, the most disparaging of international migrants. And there, of course, were other options, and we can talk about those perhaps in the Q&A. I'm very aware about time. In closing, I want to briefly mention something that's often discussed in forums when people discuss xenophobia and xenophobic violence, which is that this form of prejudice and this form of hostility is often directed at African migrants rather than other forms of migrants. Now, this is an interesting point, and a great deal of research has been done looking at the relationship between racial attitudes in South Africa and xenophobia, really trying to unpack why there is this disparity and address the issue of what some people have called Afrophobia. So, of course, I know that a wider discussion of this subject may be of interest to our forum, and please engage me on this. However, I do believe that I have run out of time. I want to thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I look forward to a greater level of engagement on these issues, and thank you again for providing me with this opportunity. And I want to close by thanking the wider South African Social Attitudes team who helped put this data together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Stephen, for highlighting, such crucial issues around racial relations, polarizations of views, and the targeted group of migrants, that it's African migrants, but also the issue around how is that also linked to racial relations in the country. And it's something we need to ponder, because I think in my, quick observations that there are class issues that you've highlighted, because you must think about African migrants in terms of where they're located. Often they get targeted when they're located in working class communities, which is in communities. And we must think about the setup of those communities, the social setup, the scrambling for resources, etc., and what happens. I'm just parking that for even, further pondering. I think the other one that you pointed out so well, it's around the racial relations, is that migrants in South Africa enter a space where there's actually no, harmony in racial relations. And in essence, so that social tension that seemed to be embedded in how, from a race perspective, humans interact in South Africa, kind of like crafts the nature of attitude towards those that would be regarded as other. I want to park that as well for much more scholarship, analysis, and more pondering. All right, so thank you so much again, Prof. Gordon. So I'm going to call upon our two panelists who are meant to step in after after Dr. Stephen. In the absence of Dr. I think that's okay. Dr. Vanya, is it Castro or Castro? You correct me, Dr. Vanya Castro. You can take your 10 to 15 minutes as a panelist and really reflect on what you think the gaps in Dr. Stephen's input, but also what do you think we should really be handling this matter going forward. I'm aware also you're one of the panelists on in the previous migration expert roundtable.
Thank you very much for the introduction. You were right, it's Gastro, so
Okay, thank you.
not the greatest sounding surname, but yeah. And yes, so today I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak today. I don't have a presentation. I just thought it's 10 minutes. I'll give a brief talk about the topic. Yeah, and so today I just wanted to address the topic of this cafe, which is social justice, economic inclusion, and immigration. South Africa has quite severe economic problems. We are, I think, the world's most economically unequal country, and this runs largely along racial lines. The country suffers from economic stagnation and widespread and increasing unemployment, which undermines the social stability and political stability of the country. At the same time, while this has been evolving over the past decade or longer, many immigrants have entered the country, particularly since the beginning of the democratic dispensation, when the borders opened up to the rest of the continent. And many immigrants who come into the country enter informal business sectors and are also employed in low-skilled jobs. And this, to a degree, understandably, draws hostility from many poor and low-skilled South Africans, but also amongst middle-class, wealthy South Africans. I think I've met South Africans of all backgrounds who harbor hostility towards immigrants. So political leaders have leveraged this animosity to garner support in South Africa, and these are politicians from all sides of the political spectrum. And they do this largely to build solidarity with desperate and disillusioned South Africans in the hope that it will grow their electoral base. This has implications for social justice in South Africa, both in respect of immigrants' human rights, as well as South Africans' pursuit of greater economic opportunity and equality. So just as background, as I was saying earlier, it has become increasingly common for political leaders in the country, particularly using social media and other online forms, to appeal to constituents by scaremongering about immigration. With very little evidence, leaders have claimed that the underlying cause of many social evils, such as crime, disease, unemployment, and inequality, is uncontrolled immigration. So many, and it's also been increasingly common for political leaders to declare an intention to regulate and control foreign economic activities in the country, both by curbing foreign businesses, but also by more recently trying to set quotas and make it harder for employers to employ foreign workers. This type of pattern is not new, particularly in post-colonial African states, where regimes inflamed hostilities towards perceived foreigners. A lot of researchers in this field are very familiar with a discussion by Frantz Fanon on xenophobia in post-colonial Africa, which he describes as one of the pitfalls of national consciousness. He describes, and I'll quote, "In the Ivory Coast, the anti-Dahomey and anti-Voltaic troubles are in fact racial riots. The Dahomey and Voltaic peoples, who control the greater part of petty trade, are once independence is declared, the object of hostile manifestations on the part of the people of the Ivory Coast. From nationalism, we have passed into ultranationalism, to chauvinism, and finally to racism." So other authors such as Mahmoud Mandani have also observed this pattern of xenophobia that is often developed in the aftermath of independence in many African states. And this has not gone so well for many African countries. For instance, in Ghana in 1969, the country decided to outlaw foreigners from engaging in all forms of retail trade, which saw a huge amount of flight of foreign retailers. Many of them were Lebanese, some of them were Nigerian, and it had a terrible impact on the post-colonial Ghanaian economy. It led to food shortages, job losses, and business closures. And eventually, the president at the time, Busia, his whole regime was overthrown in a coup, largely because of the terrible state of the country's economy. So these type of post-colonial examples should act as a warning to South Africa, as extreme and repressive measures against the economic activities of migrants and foreigners threaten to undermine both the social and economic rights and interests of South Africans and foreigners. And I'll just give some examples. So the one problem with the heightened focus on the economic activities of migrants and the scaremongering about it is that it distracts the country from actually focusing on the key causes of unemployment and economic decline in the country. For instance, corruption, failed policies, the collapse of parastatals. And furthermore, there's very little evidence that's ever put forward by political leaders substantiating these claims. So for instance, StatsSA data and also the presentation that Stephen shared earlier showed that on the whole, foreign migrants don't cause widespread economic harm to the countries where they enter, and nor do they make up the majority or a huge share of workers in the country. And then policies that view immigrant businesses solely as a threat also fail to adequately leverage their potential for economic growth. Many immigrants run businesses in South Africa have introduced new economic outlets, networks, and infrastructures in cities. They also create transnational links across the continent that have benefited South African exporters. In many other countries, the prevalence of immigrant businesses and immigrant links are leveraged through state policies and state actions. But in South Africa, there's the prevalence of immigrant entrepreneurship is either just ignored or political leaders are and have made active attempts to try and eliminate it. An example of just trying to ignore these potential benefits can be shown through a recent statement by Gauteng Premier David Makura, who said that to an audience of South Africans in Orange Farm, he said, "I want to say this to you. You must take back the spaza shops because we want these businesses to thrive generation after generation. The township economy bill is not meant to foreigners. It is only meant for South Africans." And so with that attitude, we are never really going to leverage the true potential of immigrant entrepreneurship in the country. And apart from the potential of these businesses, clamping down on foreign-owned businesses, as we saw in the example of Ghana, also creates a risk of real economic harm and disruption. For instance, many businesses pay rent to South African landlords. Others employ South Africans. Others provide low prices and efficient services to low-income South Africans. And they also purchase goods from South African suppliers such as Macro and various wholesalers. So by just removing these businesses or trying to clamp down, curtail, eliminate them, there's a real risk of disrupting and undermining the economy, especially when we are not certain that South Africans would be able to take over all these businesses. So far in South Africa, when it comes to the regulation of foreign workers and foreign enterprises, very little has been concretely done, not due to lack of willpower and intention, but largely because of legal impediments such as the Constitution and international law. However, this has not stopped many citizens from venting anger and hostility against foreign businesses. And unfortunately, the state has often not clamped down on these activities. For instance, often in cases of xenophobic looting, a few people might be arrested, but they are thereafter released. And often there is not enough done to actually bring instigators of xenophobic violence to book. And this has led to a kind of culture of lawlessness, in particular in relation to foreign businesses, where people feel that they can act however they wish in regards to crime and robberies and mob riots. But eventually, this has actually come back to bite South African businesses, which we saw during the July riots in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal last year, where this culture of violence actually turned around to affect both South African and foreign national businesses and saw huge damage to South Africa's economy. And apart from what I've mentioned before, the lost opportunity, the potential risk of economic harm in these kinds of policies, which are increasingly being considered and debated, there are other factors to consider, such as South Africa's diplomatic relations, South African companies operating especially across the continent in Africa, which are often targeted by other African nations when there's xenophobic riots in South Africa, as well as the potential impression given to foreign investors. So while the state should adequately deal with immigration, that there should be policing, enforcement of immigration laws, migrants and immigrants legally in the country, such as asylum seekers and refugees and other people who have lawful work permits, should be welcomed and treated with dignity by citizens and leaders alike. They shouldn't be used as political footballs to get votes. That's very dangerous for our economic, political, and social stability. And it will not help advance social justice in the country either. Instead, advancing social justice demands looking at the systemic conditions as well as the leadership choices made by South Africans in South Africa that underpin the country's current predicaments. And at the same time, we should ensure that we build an inclusive, human rights-based society that protects vulnerable and marginalized people. So that's my talk for today, and I look forward to hearing comments and various views about the issue of migration and social justice.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Castro. I mean, for such a very illuminating presentation. I mean, I like how you kind of like trace the history of xenophobic incidents in Africa, because I think it's important that we need to start learning lessons. We shouldn't really repeat what has been done in other countries, and I think it would be interesting as part of maybe social justice team as an exercise to track through some of those negative impact, but also at the same time, what were the interventions, so that we can even learn that as a society. At the same time, I like how you also just oppose, again, migration as well as the economic issues in South Africa and, the opportunity cost associated with that. So one of the key things, though, I would have really liked you to address, and I want you to think about it, is really also it's around how do we talk about the issue of the structure of our economy, which is mainly around monopolistic and oligopolistic, right? And exclusive by design. And how do we then begin to make it sure that we open up spaces for both South Africans, I think in the same spirit of last Thursday's discussion, how do you open up opportunities for local South Africans and migrants so that you actually eliminate the social tension? Because the exclusionary nature of the economy, kind of like literally allows those who are right at the bottom of the economy to turn against each other. Let me pack that and you'll apply money, then we'll come back. I think the next speaker is Mr. Louis Mboko. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, excellent. You have your 10 to 15 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to speak on this case. And I'm really privileged to be in this room today and listening to all the views and all the ideas and all the solutions that are trying to be created to create harmony within South Africa. So when I looked at this issue, it's something that is close to me because I'm an immigrant myself from Zimbabwe. So I've really been closely monitoring these issues, obviously with my hands tied, but as long as you have a voice, as long as you have opportunities like this, it gives you the room to actually engage and take things further. So how I'm going to use my 10 minutes is I'll start with one of my favorite quotes, which I learned back in high school and I've carried it throughout my whole life, which is called cure the disease and not the symptoms. And why I like this quote is if we have a patient, who just got involved in an accident, and we have doctors who then try to deal with one thing, for example, a headache on that patient, they are not really solving the actual problem. And we have to first go to the root of the problem and see what is wrong with this person, what is causing the headache that the individual has. So I'll build up, and I think the previous speakers have already set like a very good foundation for me to continue and carry forward. For example, with Dr. Gordon, all those interesting statistics, and also introducing the fact that is it really xenophobia, or to some extent it's Afrophobia, which is a question that everyone always asks. And is it just discrimination to everyone who's an immigrant, which is happening in South Africa, or it's only targeted to a specific group of people? And I also like the opinion or like what Dr. Castro also introduced, that we now see a lot of politicians using migrants, or using the problem, and using even underprivileged individuals as political pawns in their story, so that they can garner votes, so that they can build that solidarity at the bottom of the economy. And then, because that's where majority of the people unfortunately are in South Africa, because of the big inequality that's in the country. So I looked at this issue from development economics point of view, which is something that I'm studying and something that I'm really passionate about. And the first thing that I looked at, and going back to like my main heading in this argument, like whereby I'm trying to find a solution where we treat the actual problem and not just the symptoms of the disease, is if we look at the real problems that are plaguing South Africa, and the previous speakers have mentioned it as well, it's poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So now when you have these problems already within an economy, you are bound to have less social cohesion, and it's exemplified by a lot of countries that are unequal, whereby like you have a group of people who feel that they are satisfied with things that are going on, and at the same time, on the extreme end, you have people who are dissatisfied by the system itself. So these problems, obviously, they are more inflated by the issue that this is not just a South African issue, but you also have a lot of poverty and other socioeconomic problems within neighboring countries, within other African countries, which have driven a lot of migration, obviously, towards South Africa. And this comes back to the spillover effects of in the region. Like if one country is doing well, or like doing better economically compared to another country, you're bound to have people moving from that country to the other country. And I think one of the solutions for this would be, I think it has been mentioned by the previous speakers as well, regional collaboration on solving the problems, because this is not just a problem that can be solved with South Africa, because you also have a very big problem of illegal immigration within the country. And if you have to deal with that, you also have to include other regional parties to ensure that everyone, almost like everyone in the continent, is improving their economies and obviously it's not like a baby that we can just put on South Africa's lap, but as a country that's supposed, it's regarded as a upper middle income country, but it's surrounded by a lot of low income countries, so it can play a role of being a leader in trying to facilitate economic growth in those countries. Because if that issue is ignored, they're also bound to get the spillover effects by having a lot of people moving from those countries to South Africa. And then I am now getting into the issue of like now what's happening on the ground. And so you have operations like Dudula, you have a lot of political rhetoric to sort of like ignite the flames at the bottom, and to say that everything that South Africa has been facing has been a result of immigrants in our country. So it's immigrants doing crime, immigrants doing this. And if you go on Twitter these days, whenever there's something bad, a lot of people, their first question is, what was the nationality of the individual? And I think we were pretty much helped by some of the stats from Dr. Gordon in terms of like even the numbers of immigrants that are in South Africa. You start seeing the discrepancy between what the people on the ground actually believe and what is really happening. Not saying that foreigners are not committing crime. Everyone, like not everyone, like a lot of people, including the locals, are also committing crime within South Africa. But now what happens when there is no harmony between the informal institutions and the formal institutions? That's so what I mean by that, by institutions, I'm talking about the set of rules. Now you have a policing, or like immigration police, and you also have the lawmakers, and you also have, that's your formal institutions, your formal structures. So in the absence of them completely or thoroughly doing their job within communities, let's say on immigration policy, that's when you start finding extreme organizations or individuals being able to actually lead the people. That's where like informal structures fit in. And the solution for that is obviously, like, if you have to design an immigration policy, or if you have to design a policy where you ensure that everyone in the country is legal, you should also ensure that the people who work with that law, or the civil servants who are at the bottom, who are supposed to implement the rules or like observe how the rules are being being practiced on the ground, they must be empowered as well and be knowledgeable enough, and also take proper effort. Because now what you are seeing is just individuals choosing that, oh, we are a community, we can solve the problem that can be solved by the police or that can be solved by the immigration, which means that there's a disconnect between the informal and the formal institutions. And this takes me to like what I've been mentioning, to make it a two-sided story, whereby the first issue that I mentioned, which is the root causes of problems in South Africa, which are poverty, inequality, and unemployment, they have to be addressed directly. And if there's no emancipation of people at the bottom, if the levels of inequality remain like this, there won't be social cohesion. And unfortunately, the people who are at the very bottom, and in this case, the individuals without even any rights to go and report something at the police or at the institutions, get kicked because they are now the ball. If everyone is frustrated, they just take it out on the guy who's at the bottom of the barrel, and that is what has been happening. And to deal with such an issue, I feel like there is a really big need to actually start solving the problems of inequality. And where do we get the instruments to use this? And we go back to things like education. We go back to things like how opportunities being availed. And I liked what the question that was posed by the host to Dr. Castro, to say, how then do we create opportunities, and how then do we try to level the ground? And in all the studies, majority of them that I've seen, it goes back to your education system, the healthcare system, how the poor accesses that, and also understanding that grants have been really good for South Africa in terms of development context and solving things like hunger, but they are not enough. Because if you look at like how the education system is already, it goes back to inequality. You have 90%, you have 10% of the best schools producing more A's in mathematics and science than 90% of the remaining schools in South Africa. So already that's already a big stat, which shows you that these are fundamental problems that need to be solved within the country, and in order to break the cycle of poverty. And the other part that I was just looking at when I was doing research on this, which brings back to the other side of the story, is to focus on the immigration policy. So recently, I've been seeing the rules getting changed day by day. For example, one rule that surprised me was initially, if somebody completed a degree in critical skills, and the reason why they're called critical skills is because there's already a shortage, not only in South Africa, but all over the world, which is leading to a lot of countries taking the talent, or like people who get educated here in South Africa in higher education, they're now just going elsewhere, of which the government is losing a lot, given the fact that South Africa's education, especially in the higher education sector, is very good and well subsidized. And you can get like a better ranked university here, and you pay less compared to like what someone would pay in the US. So now it brings me to the issue of like the brain drain and immigration policy. If now you've trained someone at a higher education institution, and then you tell them that for you to be able to get a work permit, which is the legal employment structure, or like the path they're supposed to follow, and you tell them that you have to get a full contract or a full-time contract. This is a recent graduate, and most of the or like how it was in the past, how the policy was before it was changed, was that they would give them like a visa for a year to go and look for employment, and then after that you can come with a full employment. This is just an example of a rule that was scrapped and surely there's only one thing that this rule is doing. It's to limit the number of immigrants that do get employed. But at the same time, it's contradictory to the fact that you are saying it's a critical skill and we have a shortage of this skill, but you're making it difficult for that individual to stay in the system. And I'll give an example of what other countries, obviously it's in the developed context, what other countries across the European Union do. Once someone attain a degree at their institution, an example is in the Netherlands, they give them 2 years, a visa for 2 years to try look for employment, to see if they actually want to stay within the system. And the whole point is to obviously facilitate their economic development, because they consider these people that like we offered them an education and they can contribute positively to the economy. And if you have more people contributing positively to the economy, you're bound to also have economic success, which has spillover effects on the rest of the economy. And these are some of, it's just one example out of like a lot of rules that were actually changed to make it stringent. And you start asking yourself if these rules were well researched, or it's just a political bait. It's using immigrants as a political pawns, so that some agendas can be driven, or like someone can garner votes, as was mentioned by the previous speaker. So I don't think I still have a lot of time, and I'll contribute further in the question and answer period.
Mr. Mboko, I mean, for that reflection, I think you've elucidated so well the need for dealing with the root cause instead of dealing with symptoms, which I think that was again the the genesis of the discussion in the previous round table. So you articulated it so well, but also the contradictions in the system, formal rules versus the informal rules, and the power, particularly around the policing, the power they enjoy when they get on the streets, etc. So, and I think, colleagues, we have our two panelists who have really reflected so well and kind of like borrowed some of the stats that Dr. Gordon had presented much more earlier. I think now the process should be that, can we open up for any reflections, questions to the three speakers? Perhaps in the absence of that, let me ask, I've already kind of like, oh yes, there's a question. Ms. Ramwana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Palisa, and thank you to the speakers and the panelists for today's discussion. It was really good. My question goes to the panelists. Yes, we are talking about statistics and the research that's been done and has been conducted in South Africa already. My question then goes to, what can we do other than social cohesion in order to make sure that we have a better integration of South Africans and other nationalities that come into South Africa, especially people coming from SADC regions? Because I think as a region, we need to be more accommodating to each other, towards each other. So what would you then say or suggest in terms of that? Thank you.
Thank you for Ms. Randa. Yes. for that, you know, I mean, I think, you know, the solution thinking, because I do think that there should be, you know, short-term intervention, medium-term, and as well as suppose as a long-term. South Africa celebrates 27 or 28 years of its constitutional democracy, and there are certain things that citizens expect of them. And if those things have not been addressed, what is it that we do? But I mean, what are the, you know, based with that question, what are the things that we should be doing in the short, medium to long term, particularly to make it sure that we, you know, we create a conducive society for everyone to come to South Africa to come and live. And I'm really expanding Chili's question that, you know, even domestically, what are the type of policy interventions that we should be implementing? Okay, so I'm going to, I suppose that question really, the futurist question was in if any of the panelists can take it up. I see Vanya, you would like to be on the floor. Dr. Castro.
Oh, hi. Oh, I just my microphone was on, but
Okay.
so I'm not a particular expert on social cohesion and how to encourage social cohesion. I think that it's a difficult task, especially with because a lot of the immigrants in South Africa are actually first generational. Increasingly, it's second generational. And I think once you get to the level of second generational, it's easier in terms of I work closely with the Somali community, for instance, and there's low levels of, you know, even ability to speak English. And all of those elements, culture, religion, but even I think they always highlight just the language barrier makes integration really hard, especially with first generational immigrants. I don't think that would apply so much to the SADC region, though. I think leadership is very important. It's important for leaders to send out a message which encourages foreigners and South Africans not to be more welcoming and open to each other. Right now, there's a lot of polarizing discourse and people being cast as being against each other. So I think strong leadership, dealing with xenophobia and cultures of xenophobia, xenophobic thinking, because that also creates divisions between communities. Things like the school syllabus, I don't think South Africans really understand enough. Even myself, I often am aware of how little I know, and I've had to force myself to learn more about African history, the African continent. Sometimes I don't even know where certain African countries are. And yeah, and sometimes we also have to acknowledge that things, yeah, it takes time, and it can't really be forced, and we have to just grapple with difference, with different cultures, different religions, and just create a society that's just more comfortable with that and comfortable with people who are different and diversity. But I'm not an expert on it, so I'd be interested to hear what other people also have to say on that question.
Yeah. No, but I think you point out, I mean, the issue of leadership. It's so important about leaders showing, you know, some form of leadership, but also the type of language that gets used when you talk about immigrants and, you know, appealing to South Africans or even, you know, migrant receiving countries. Because I also think that, you know, in the same way, you know, Dr. Cross, you had actually articulated the history, is that this has a potential of repeating itself into another country. So while the debate today is really about South Africa, but I think we must use this to make it sure that actually we rally Africans to be tolerant of each other and actually understand that migration is something that is likely to be here to stay with us forever. And what is it that we need to do when every time we have migrants amongst ourselves? Any of the speakers that would really like to comment?
Oh, hi. Yes, I think the question raises a very, very important issue. So we can start with the National Action Plan to fight xenophobia, racism, and related intolerance, which outlines a series of policy interventions to create greater social cohesion as well as target xenophobia. Now, these include, of course, communication campaigns, but also in a more general sense, it's about tackling not just xenophobia in isolation from other forms of prejudice, but tackling prejudice in South Africa at a larger level. So existing public opinion data will tell you that anti-immigrant sentiment is strongly associated with interracial attitudes. So what do we mean by this? So if you have a negative opinion of other racial groups, you view them as threatening, as alien, as, kind of evil, then you're much more likely to have a negative opinion of foreigners. Now, this is true regardless of the race of the individual person. So white people, we see this trend. Colored people, we see the same trend. The Black African majority, the same trend again. Indeed, one of the best predictors of anti-immigrant sentiment is to really ask people how they feel about, say, Indian people or colored people or white people, racial minorities. And this will correlate very well with their feelings on foreigners. And of course, if we turn our attention to racial minorities, the pattern repeats itself, but the attitudes towards Black people become a much stronger predictor of anti-immigrant sentiments. Now, one of the serious problems we have in South Africa, and a number of very prominent authors have brought this up, particularly the work of Neum Kumos, is the issue of Pan-Africanism. South Africans have extremely low levels of Pan-Africanism. They do not feel connected to the continent. They do not identify with people in other African countries. It's a serious problem. Now, despite the lip service given to Pan-Africanism by national leaders on occasion, very little has been done to instill a sense of Pan-Africanism in the general population. Existing public opinion research that is currently under peer review suggests that promoting a sense of Pan-Africanism would be extremely beneficial to creating greater social cohesion in South Africa, reducing xenophobia. So there's a wide variety of things that can be done. Another issue that has only recently got attention and is still under debate is the issue of immigrant integration programs. Other countries have very successfully experimented with programs that successfully integrate immigrants into host communities with a focus on economic and social integration. These policies, while initially a little expensive in the first few years, tend to pay off both economically and socially in the long term and tend to be very beneficial, and indeed have shown good rates of return, even in poorer countries where they've been tried, such as Portugal. And there's have even been some successes with different forms of this in Uganda. So it is possible for policy interventions to make a meaningful contribution to reduce this issue. However, we must stop thinking about xenophobia as a form of prejudice distinct from other forms. It is quite closely connected to existing problems of social cohesion and related to problems we have around social justice and just inclusion in a very general sense.
I really like your, Dr. Gordon. I think the issue of Pan-Africanism, I think we need to, as an ongoing conversation, we need to unpack what's the meaning of that and what systems that seem to have eroded that sense of Pan-Africanism, but also what is it as Africans? And I agree with you about, firstly, the exposure to the African continent. In fact, you hear South Africans more often, and this is across race, where they would say, I'm traveling to Africa. And you think, so exactly where you are if you still have to travel to Africa. So when they are referring, they are traveling to Tanzania, or Harare or Kinshasa will say, I'm traveling to Africa. So I agree with you. I think there needs to be an investment in Pan-Africanism as as an ideology that is actually meant to connect, Africans. Absolutely. I wanted to give Mr. Mbokoto to just again, because his contribution was on a different entry point, and then I'll come back to you, Mr. MB Klaba, Dr. Klaba. You noted. Mr. Luis Mbokoto? Menier?
Thank you very much. And this is, I think what the previous speakers have mentioned is something that I do resonate with, and I feel like there is a lot of information or like education that needs to be done in terms of like just educating people about these statistics. For example, what we were being shown earlier by Dr. Gordon's, because the problem now is with the internet these days, or like spaces like Twitter, we do have a lot of misinformation and a lot of disinformation, which is one of the biggest problems. And as we were mentioning earlier, and as other speakers have mentioned, this is more likely, or like these problems are more likely to resonate with people at the bottom line of like a socioeconomic status. So now there must be ways, or like there must be research on like which ways can we do to actually make sure that the information that gets to people is not just from an anonymous account spreading hatred, which just says that this is what is happening in the country, so we must come together and fight. So I think it comes back to even this problem has been faced with countries like the US during elections and in periods like that, where you have a lot of misinformation and a lot of disinformation. So that's not a unique problem for South Africa or like Africa as a whole, but like it's a problem that the world is facing, because now we're in a digitalized era where someone can just go on Twitter, say something without any form of accountability. So I think it's also very important for community leaders and leaders at all level to be educated on these issues, so that they can pass that information or correct information to individuals in communities, so that they can we eliminate a lot of those gaps between formal structures and informal structures, whereby someone who doesn't really know anything about it can just go and say, okay, we need to go take back our country now. These people are roots to our problems. So I think that's my contribution on that.
Dr. Klaba, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the panel members for such impressive contributions. Okay, so Professor Gordon, I've read quite a number of your impressive academic articles on xenophobia. So you ask people to estimate the number of immigrants in South Africa. So my question is, what value? How does that sum up the problem? Yeah, maybe you can explain that question. Then the other question is it possible for, I'm just thinking, is it possible for South Africans to debate issues about immigration without being labeled xenophobic? Because in South Africa currently, even in terms of research, when experts speak about xenophobia, I feel like by the way, my name is Brilliant, and I'm an immigrant as well. So when I tend to look at the research, it's so skewed against South Africans. And I think part of the problem is the tendency to describe xenophobia as a South African problem and not an African problem. In my view, to some extent, African leaders need to take responsibility for some of the things that happen in South Africa, for example. And you spoke about Pan-Africanism. And I like the other speaker, I think it's Louis, who spoke about the need to speak into the root causes of xenophobia. And yeah, I'd like you to reflect on that. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Dr. Klaba, for those important questions, because I think it's true that the focus right now, by the way, is on host countries. But how do we make it sure that we use the opportunity for the current confluence of issues in South Africa to actually, bring more spotlight to, African leadership crisis, but at the same time, that in fact we look at our own communities, whether if people would pack their bags from South Africa and move to Zambia, what would they be expected to do? And I do think that it's that's why I think the idea about Pan-Africanism should not really be about South Africans as such, but it should be about all Africans. I mean, I'm remembering the fact that if you want to move to Switzerland, the first issue they want you to do is that they want you to speak French as a requirement so that you are familiar with the culture. But if you move into other countries have their own as well as the regulation. Now, I'm not saying for any other reason that we should be endorsing some of those, but I'm saying what should we be learning, from other countries that kind of like are purported to have managed the integration much more easier, than others. Panelists, there's a questions from Dr. Tsaba. How do South Africans address the issue of xenophobia without being labeled as being xenophobic? What are the subjective and objective issues that are embedded into the migration conversation? Yes, Dr. Castro.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point because, and I've heard it before, and I think even me as a researcher, I'm sometimes guilty of, having my own ideological kind of orientation and not being open to people with differing ones. And I think to have honest conversation, people need to feel confident to speak freely and share their thoughts without feeling judged. And I think maybe even at forums like this, it's important to acknowledge that people have differing and competing views on it because it's a complex issue. It's not a simple, easy one. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I try to kind of also engage from that perspective. And I think one of the things we also fail to acknowledge, and I also agree that xenophobia is not just a South African problem, it's an African problem. South Africa has one of the most progressive refugee and asylum seeker policies on the continent, if not the most progressive one. I can give terrible examples of policies in other countries on the continent. And so I'm very glad that we don't, and I think immigrants and especially asylum seekers and refugees should be very grateful for the current policy that we have, but I don't know how long this current policy will remain the same. So I think that those were very important things to acknowledge. And I think as part of learning about the rest of the continent, we should also become aware of how xenophobia has manifested in the rest of the continent, both historically, but even to this day. I remember last week when we had the round table, a representative from Ghana coming to speak and saying how in Ghana, Nigerian immigrants and Ghanaians have also clashed. So it's not an issue that's unique to South Africa, and part of Pan-Africanism should be about learning more about it on the continent, and creating greater awareness about the phenomenon and how it extends beyond just South Africa.
Yes, I mean, thank you for that, Dr. Castro. And I mean, these lessons from African countries, really, we need to really, tap into them. And I think we probably truly, as I was saying, that we have to really elevate the conversations to Africa than South Africa, because people are going to move into different countries, and we shouldn't start the conversation at the country level when there's a crisis. Actually, we should start the conversation much more earlier before the crisis hits. Dr. Gordon, your comments on the questions, and Mr. Mboko, I'll come to you.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, so obviously there are some very important ideas being put forward. Many countries in Africa have had to have very difficult debates about international migration and the quality and character of international migration. The Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, had a massive civil war, a series of civil wars in the 2000s regarding immigration, who was a citizen, who was an immigrant. Interestingly, following these civil wars, pro-immigrant sentiment went up as the country was able to reconcile some of their differences, and the nativists who started the civil wars in a violent and bloody attempt to prey on the prejudices of ordinary Cote d'Ivoirians for economic and political gain were discredited. Currently, South Africa, if we look at, say, for example, data from the Afrobarometer survey, has some of the highest levels of anti-immigrant sentiments of countries surveyed. There's about 34 countries surveyed. Certainly, there are other countries, for example, Libya and Tunisia have quite high levels of anti-immigrant sentiment. Largely, this is due to apathy and hostility towards Black Africans within those countries, who are often associated with international migration. You also see this in Morocco. So why is it important that we sort of tell the truth a little bit about the numbers of international migrants in the country? So one, the scale of international migration is often used as a justification for anti-immigrant activities as well as anti-immigrant policy. And of course, properly understanding the scale of international migration allows us to consider it as a phenomenon with our society and make appropriate policy choices around it. So, for example, the national census is in field right now. It may return a figure on international migration which is somewhat lower than the figure that is estimated by the Population Division of the United Nations, because as the national economy declines, people, they stop coming to South Africa, and of course, many people leave South Africa seeking economic opportunities elsewhere. So indeed, we might see a reduction in the number of international migrants. One of the interesting things, actually, about the rise in international migration, the bulk of it took place between 2000 and 2015, is that contacts with international migrants has risen over time, and actually then has led to more positive views of international migrants in the country. Positive contact, particularly friendship contact, being a very important determinant of pro-immigrant sentiments. So it is often said, and as the data I presented shown, that South Africans are quite xenophobic. Now, this is a prejudicial statement. It is a stereotype. South Africans are quite nuanced on their views on international migration. You know, in the same way that the Swiss are quite nuanced on their views on international migration. There's fantastic public opinion research on Swiss attitudes towards international migration, with many Swiss, particularly Swiss Germans, Swiss Italians, being quite hostile towards international migration, particularly international migrants from Islamic countries, North Africa, West Asia. So, you know, the issue of international migration is a complex one. Solving this problem will be the key to solving our problem of social cohesion. South Africa is engaging on a program of regional integration. We sponsored the African Free Trade Agreements and are trying to build stronger ties between ourselves, South Africa, and many other parts of the African continent. Now, solving our xenophobia problem will make that process much better. Of course, regional integration will make South Africa a wealthier, much more prosperous country, and will allow us to lead on the African continent in a fundamental way that I believe is what is desired, not only by our national leadership, but by ordinary people in our country. So I think it's very, very important to solve the problem of xenophobia. And I think, again, it is certainly possible to discuss public attitudes towards international migration in a way that doesn't make people seem xenophobic. Often, you know, when I present these results, I don't use words like xenophobia, preferring, you know, anti-immigrant, pro-immigrant attitudes to sort of take the discussion to a less emotive place, as many people get very emotive about the word xenophobia, much as many people also get emotive when the word racist gets thrown around, where certain people are characterized as racist for holding certain opinions regarding certain matters.
Yep, actually, I really like the last point you're making about use of words, because that's also important, so that don't seem to be painting the rest of the society as though it's actually South Africans as xenophobic, but we must be able to point that there are anti-immigrant sentiments within the South African population. Mr. Lewis Mbogoto, do you want some comments on the questions that Dr. Kaba had raised?
I think most of the stuff has already been spoken by the two previous speakers, and I think they were great answers. And there's something that I actually liked there, and it made me reflect in the sense that with a lot of researchers, and not just researchers, in even like with normal people in their day-to-day lives, there's always confirmation bias, where you try find things that you already know that this is what you want to or it supports your beliefs or your ideas or your values as well. So I personally think that this is not just a South African problem. Obviously, South Africa is in crisis, and as the other speakers said, it's not just an African problem. We also have a lot of European countries and countries across the world having this sort of problem. So and it's very unfortunate that you never get to see the counterfactual, which is like if South Africans were, for example, going to another country. And I was having that conversation the other day with one of my friends. I was like, if the roles reversed, we would have probably having the same problem within our own locales. For example, in Zimbabwe, they would have been saying the same thing. So it's very important, as Prof. Gordon just mentioned, to avoid words, for example, or generalizations to say that these people are xenophobia or these people think like that, because that's not how we experience the world or the people on a daily basis. So it's very important to understand that it's a conversation that needs to be held, and it's a conversation. It's everyone's problem, because if the other countries or like the countries that are having a lot of people move from them to other countries, if roles were reversed, they would probably be in the same crisis. So it's a very sensitive conversation that needs to it needs people to be level-headed and have engagements. And I've actually learned a lot in terms of like terminology from what Prof. Gordon was saying. It's very important. I think things like that can even make the conversations less heavy and more fruitful. And that's my contribution on that.
Yes, thank you so much, colleagues. We're almost 3 minutes to the end of the cafe. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to make any intervention with our 3 minutes. Okay. I mean, in the absence of any hand, I'm just going to, I mean, I think this was such a, you know, again, follow-up conversation from the, previous, experts of a roundtable that was hosted last week. And, I think panelists had more time now to really do a bit of a, much more deeper, deep dive. I mean, at the heart of it, I think the proposal around, open conversation about Pan-Africanism around, in Africa, so that we start learning lessons from each other, also dealing at the same time with the root causes, of some of the socioeconomic crisis, and which leads into social tension because there's a lot of scrambling for resources domestically. So, and I think that the social justice chair's team has recorded this conversation, because I do think that there are just plethora of themes that could emerge here specifically as as topical issues for us to take them up and continue the conversation. And I do think that maybe what we probably need to do now, we need to have again a much more targeted, and making sure that we expand the conversation into the SADC region, into the African, so that it's actually much more open, and to confront the issue of leadership crisis, which has led into economic exclusion or declining industrial outputs in several countries. Actually, when I was speaking I just realized that I didn't introduce myself. I just went straight into the conversation. So my name is Belly Sankom. I am a development economist. I chair the board of Oxfam, and I'm active in the gender-based violence space, and doing other things in relation to transformative procurements and market linkages. I would like, as we're left with 1 minute, I'd really like to share my, and I think with other colleagues, sincere appreciation to the speakers who had taken the time and prepared for today. But also at the same time, I'd like to really send a special thank you to the team within the Social Justice Chair Office, specifically Prakashni, who has been putting together this Social Justice Cafe today. I think with that words, colleagues, our cafe conversation has come to an end. It's adjourned. Have a blessed afternoon and a good week. Thank you very much. Or maybe should we open up for pictures, please? I know that the team always like, can you please open up for pictures? And then I'll send it through to the social justice team. Any of the colleagues who can open up for pictures? Has everybody else opened up their...
I just took one, Felisa. It's fine. I took a picture.
Oh, is it?
Yes. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Lisa.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.